Good afternoon. Hi. Everybody say hi back, so I know you're all right. How many of you had a high carbohydrate lunch and you're just going to crash like hell, like in about 10 minutes, right? If you haven't already. Maybe the brisk walk in the cold might have helped get the blood flowing a little bit, so we'll see. As Joe said, I'm Andrew Hinton. I work with an outfit called the Understanding Group. I'm a self-identified information architect, and I'll be happy to explain more about that at some point. But right now, I'm realizing that my phone is going to keep buzzing the microphone, so I'm going to move my phone down. It's cross-channel thinking there. So here we go. Without more patter from me, let's just, okay, is this working? It is working. Okay. This is an environment. Actually, at the conference, there's been a lot of talk of thinking environmentally, thinking in terms of multiple channels. In fact, from the time since I first did a version of this talk, like about a year ago, until now, I've just seen it explode, this thinking about this use of the word environment. I'm really happy to see that. But this environment doesn't have a lot of gadgets in it. This environment is a natural setting. It's full of physical, naturally occurring surfaces and objects. It's the sort of environment that humans as a species spent most of our evolutionary history in. Notice there's a stone wall. Now that's something that's made by people. It adds structure to the environment. It's an object that impedes motion, but it's also an object with cultural meaning. It signifies things. It's telling us something about that someone was marking a space and changing what this place is in some way based on a human-made structure. Like, this is where my sheep are contained, or this is where my serfs live, or something. I don't know. I don't know how ancient this wall actually is. It looks pretty old. But what if we think of this not just as an environment, but an information environment? In what ways is that a thing? Is that true here? That's largely what this talk is about. It's about the fact that because network technology is becoming so pervasive, it's so much a part of the fabric of our surroundings that we need to understand the fundamentals of how humans comprehend their environment from the very basic stuff on up, not just gadgets and screens. So regardless of the specific technology. And understanding that means understanding the kinds of information that are in the world and how they work together to create places and contexts and meanings. These are information environments that involve office supplies. So what is the difference really between shopping for them in a brick and mortar store or shopping for them through an online retailer like Amazon? If we think of the physical store as an information interface, then how much information is being conveyed and of what kind and through one interface versus another? How useful is it for the activity of deciding between a printer or a stapler? There are things that the digital environment affords us, obviously, that the physical one doesn't. We all know this. We've all been working on the web for a long time now. We know that we can do things like sort and filter and comment and all of these amazing things. And for products like office supplies that aren't really, it's not like you're buying carpet or curtains. You don't want to necessarily touch them. You just want to know what their features are. Really, this is, in a way, a more real environment than this one is if you're thinking of it in terms of what's useful to you, what's valuable to you in terms of information. The thing is now, these things are basically, there's less and less separation between these. This is have anybody seen this yet? This has been floating around for a year or so now. Tesco piloted and actually found it successful, oddly enough. This thing where they would just take over a subway station wall with this backlit, simulacrum of product, so that it's basically mashing up what place means for someone who's waiting for a train. So rather than just waiting for a train and just looking at my phone or not having anything to do, this is like, hey, do you need Snapple? Apparently in Korea they're really into Snapple. I didn't know this. I think it's really amazing. Actually I don't know that, but I'm just going based on this. This is about all I know. This and bibimbap. This is like the most I actually know about Korea. But this is cool. And this idea that this is actually a really low-tech solution, right? The actual interface here is very low-tech. It's just pictures. It's depending on this pervasive, persistent layer of our infrastructure now that we just sort of take for granted all of a sudden, which 10 years ago we thought would have been like sci-fi magic. Now it's like, oh yeah, we just do this. We just scan things, buy things. So you guys have been in enough talks at this thing now to where none of, this is just sort of the due diligence on my part to say, yep, there's all this stuff that we have now that's just getting weirder and laying this layer of information on our whole world. And it's not just that, but all the stuff around us is starting to kind of pay attention to us and watch us and know things about us in ways that are kind of invisible to us. Right? They're dealing with information that we don't necessarily perceive, and we don't understand the rules behind what's going on. The poster child of the year is the smart fridge, which apparently started spamming people a while back, just recently. I can't remember if it was a hacker or what, but yeah, a spam bot fridge. Fun. So really what I'm getting at is we're at a point now where we can't just be talking about pixels and wireframes and prototypes and responsive layouts. That's just the surface of the world that we're actually needing to understand at this point. We need to better understand the nature of our materials. Potters really understand clay. Masons really understand stone. Painters understand paint and canvases and their materials. They really have to be intimate with them and understand the properties of them and how they work. I think we need to understand information better. Information is a word that we use a lot, but I don't think that in our general practice we have a common framework for what it is. It's one of those sort of signifiers, or it's almost like a gesture of a word, like the way we say art or the way we say love or whatever. We just sort of use it. So I tried finding, I'm working on as Joe said, I'm working on this book, and it's about designing context, and turns out context really has everything to do with information. And I just wanted to find, okay, where's like the standard? Where are we now on information? What is it? And turns out there's not like a definition. There's a lot of them, and many of them are really amazing, and it's still an ongoing kind of like conversation in academia and elsewhere about like, okay, how is it that we actually define and frame what information is? So I finally decided to be a pluralist and say, forget trying to find the one true meaning. It's actually a lot more value in taking several of the meanings and seeing how they work together as a system. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at digital, semantic, and physical, but in the other way. Physical, semantic, and digital. Digital's in italics because it's a little weirder, but we'll get to that. So we're going to start with physical information. Physical information has to do with the ecological relationship between an animal and its physical environment. Okay. In fact, I used to call this ecological information, but it was confusing, so I just physical information. So the green field that we were looking at earlier was mostly made up of physical information that creatures use to know where they can go and what they can do in their surroundings, including us. We're creatures. Some of us more than others. The way I'm framing this comes from something called ecological psychology, which has been adapted for a branch of study called embodied cognition. Now, a lot of us heard of embodied cognition in some way, form, or fashion. A lot of people have heard of it through the work of like George Lakoff, which is really about like the embodiment of language. So there are a lot of different schools of thought, even among embodied cognition. I'm not going to go into all that, but this is sort of a different take that's a little more related to something called radical embodied cognition. So embodied cognition, basically, no matter what school of embodied cognition you're talking about, the premise is that the way that traditional cognitive science thinks about how cognition works, that sort of came up alongside the information science revolution in the mid-20th century, thinks of the brain as like a computer that works on, that thinks by using representations and logical functions of the world, and that the body is basically a sensory mechanism and then a sort of an order-taking mechanism. Okay, senses saw this, I'm going to process that in some logical way and now tell the body what to do. Embodied cognition says, well, the environment and the body actually have a lot to do with the way we think and the way that we perceive and understand the world, and even in higher order levels of thinking, logical thinking and symbolic thinking. So a big part of this is action, the idea that we are not these stationary creatures, that terrestrial creatures actually evolved in motion, and that's part of it's integrated in. It's you can't separate that from cognition. Much of our daily activity is unconsciously nudged and controlled by our environment, right? And even in behavioral economics, that's one example where rules and structures in the environment to kind of nudge us one way or the other without us really thinking about it in the terms of how the decisions we make and the things we do every day. This is an incredibly rich thing that in other versions of this, I've gone on for an hour about. I'm not going to do that because we don't have much time, but I'm going to touch on a few bits. Louise Barrett, who wrote this book called Beyond the Brain, which I highly recommend. It's a really recent book, and I think it's one of the better expressions of this. I mean, it's long, it's pretty intense, but it's very readable and fascinating. But this is a quote from a talk of hers that I really thought summed it up nicely. There's no such thing as disembodied cognition for living creatures, because all of our cognition has to be embodied. Brains evolved in the service of action. Brains evolved in the service of bodies and the environment. But we reify and kind of like project this self-enclosed brain universe, but it kind of leads us astray sometimes. Some embodied cognition theorists have heavily adopted the work of James J. Gibson, who I have fallen in love with. This guy's work, once I discovered it and started reading it, it's just so unbelievably fascinating. But he was a scientist of something called ecological psychology that I mentioned before. He actually helped us start the whole field of it. And now he's really seen kind of as a pioneer of embodied cognition. His stuff has been appropriated by traditional cognitive science at times, but not fully understood or necessarily used the way that he intended it. But now his whole sort of corpus is starting to be sort of looked at again and like, wow, okay, what's really going on with this and being taken more seriously. So anyway, but great stuff. I'm going to talk about a little bit of that as we go. But Gibson purposefully used the word information for this body-environment relationship. He argued that our bodies do something he called information pickup, where the body's perceptual system, which, by the way, not eyes, not ears, but perceptual system, because he's like, you can't really consider any of these as pieces. They're all one big system. Where the body's perceptual system detects structural cues in the environment that specify what actions the body can take. He argued that this happens directly with little or no need for brain processing. That he didn't say that there is no brain activity, obviously. There is an internal life of the mind, but that it comes from this body-environment relationship, right? That's the roots of it. So he also invented this idea of affordance. Who's heard of affordance? Hopefully everybody's heard of affordance. If you saw Don Norman, I imagine he mentioned affordance at some point. I couldn't be here for his talk, unfortunately. So the perceived functional properties of objects, places, and events in relation to an individual perceiver. Basically, my body, my perceptual system, partly because as an infant, very early crawling around, I realized that surfaces that were a little higher than other surfaces would bring my body upward, right? So I learned that affordance. By the way, basically all affordances are learned. There's no such thing as a natural UI. We learn everything at some point. We just forgot when we learned it. But basically, these stairs, right, are a built environment thing, and my body knows if I walk on them, if I climb them, I'm going to go upward. So affordance was and still is actually a pretty radical idea. The way that it's been appropriated by some others is not always quite the way he meant it, because again, he was coming from this different way of thinking of cognitive science. He thought of it as the organizing principle behind all perception, that basically you don't perceive anything unless you can perceive the structural information about what it affords your body, what it affords you as an organism. So this all sounds super theoretical, but again, this is getting at like, okay, what is the nature of our materials? And that if the nature of our materials has to do with information and how we understand information, then we need to understand these things and figure out what does this mean to us. Gibson created this really marvelous system of principles and components that work as building blocks for how we perceive our environment and its affordances. I can only barely touch on them here, but here are two that I think are really important. One is invariance, and it's the property of environmental structure that makes some of it persist over time so that we can make sense of the whole. In other words, invariant things are things that, like, for example, this wood or whatever wood-like substance this is, right? There's something about this substance and this surface that is persistent enough, or the ground is persistent enough to where, as a creature, like I can kind of count on, perception-wise, this being a solid thing that I can lean on or I can walk on. The earth and the sky for terrestrial creatures are sort of the outer bounds of our perceived world. And so they're the main invariant features. They don't go away. The ground doesn't just disappear on us. Very rarely do we step on ground that turns out not to be ground. So it's persistent enough so that as a species, that's just sort of part of the way that we comprehend the world. So this can be a really useful idea in digital work and other kinds of work, because in digital software and in digital interfaces and things, you don't have to have invariance, right? With physical stuff, with physical information, you have to have it because it's intrinsically part of the way the solid world works. It's the way atoms work. But in digital stuff, we can make something feel solid and then take it away. We can change it. And the problem is we don't pay attention sometimes to what the invariant structures are that are actually helping people orient and understand their world in the sort of a digital space. Nestedness is fascinating. The idea that we perceive the environment as structures that relate to one another is nested. A stream is in a valley, which is between mountains, which is part of a range, which is between earth and sky. There aren't always definite boundaries, though, and this isn't a purely logical relationship. There are overlaps and redundancies and shifts of meaning. A stick on the ground can be kindling or a club, or it can be part of a roof over my head and a shelter. It's not just one defined thing and how it relates to the rest of the environment. This is a powerful idea also when we look at things like faceted navigation, or where the meaning of a piece of content or an object shifts depending on what perspective a user is bringing to it. I worked with a home improvement retailer a while back, and one of the things was just trying to figure out, well, if somebody's searching for the word kitchen, that can mean a lot of different things. Their world is nested in different ways, and even in one user session, the word kitchen might be about, I need to fix my faucet, but then 5 minutes in, they're thinking, I'm thinking about redoing my kitchen. That's two very different ways of thinking of kitchen, right? So this translates into the way that we do semantic work as well, which we'll get to in a second. There are a lot of components that Gibson outlines, and one of the things I'm working on is trying to turn that into a framework that we can use for digital and semantic environments, so that the idea being that human perception this is what we mean when we say intuitive, that our perception kind of wants to not have to think about this stuff. Our perception wants to just sort of walk on it like ground. And everything that we have to think about beyond that is work, right? All right, so of course humans don't just exist in these raw physical surfaces and objects. We add to the environment. And in addition to buildings and roads and such, we add language to our world. So the semantic mode of language, or the semantic mode of information is, in short, language. But I mean language in the broad sense of things we put in the environment to communicate with people, right? In the sense that we mean when we say, like, linguistics. This can be all sorts of stuff: speech, gestures, text, iconography, and even buildings have semantic qualities to them, like they signify things, even though they have physical attributes. In fact, until the printing press and literacy was a thing, buildings were were the main way that information was conveyed to people, like churches and friezes and all these pictorial and statues and all this kind of stuff. Like, this is the narratives and stories were told in those kinds of ways. And we still tell stories with buildings, just a little more obliquely, a little more nuanced. Language is environment. Language is something that we put out into the world. When I'm speaking, I'm vibrating the air, I'm changing the environment. And then you have learned over time, those of you who speak English, to pick up on the information that's in that vibration and understand what it means, just because of the conventions that we've all grown up together with, right? That's just how language works. This guy, Andy Clark, another really good book called Supersizing the Mind, talks about how language is a form of cognitive scaffolding, that it persists in the environment as new structure that allows us to make other structures. We wouldn't have most of what we think of as civilization without language, without using it as like this scaffolding. So we tend to think of language as something that is ephemeral and that we add on to physical stuff. But language is actually, it's like that old thing about the fish in the water. The two young fish are talking to each other, and the old fish comes by and says, "The water feels great today." And the young fish turns to the other young fish and says, "What's water?" Because they're just not used to thinking about it. They take it for granted. This is how we treat language. We take it for granted. But the problem is we're getting to a point where we have to think about it more explicitly, more consistently. Because language is the primary human interface to complex systems. In fact, that's what we use to make the complex systems to begin with. And then once we've made them, we have to use language to understand them and navigate them and share them and inhabit them together. Language structures are an architecture that we live within together, whether we know it or not. Whether these structures are defined explicitly, like in this early IBM management diagram, or defined tacitly through the collective assumptions of a shared culture, the way we talk and write about our shared environment is also a structural feature of that environment, okay? So those of you who've worked in organizations know that the way the organization talks about stuff sometimes creates invisible structures that actually constrain what gets done, right? I was working with a client a while back that was a media company, and they were talking about the second screen, right? If you heard the second screen meme, the idea that like the TV is the primary screen, and then we've got all these other things that are second screen. But the problem is that was actually going to end up getting written into their databases and into their like entity relationship diagrams and shit, right? Because well, we just take it for granted. There's second screen. This is the second screen program. We're going to build all this stuff for a year about second screen, and the problem is there's assumptions built into the term second screen, because now we're realizing, well, hang on, for a lot of people, this is their first screen, right? Or it's nested, right? It's nested in the sense that right now this is my first screen, and now this is my first screen, and now somebody else's screen is my first screen, right? So the way we talk about the world can get written into the world before we realize it. Okay, so humans aren't just perceivers, as I said, of physical structure. We depend as much or more on the symbolic workings of language, on semantic information as a part of our environment. In this picture of a staircase at City Lights bookstore, it's the same staircase you saw earlier, we see stairs that have intrinsic structural information that our bodies perceive as affording the ability to walk upward, right? Just like we said. But there's this other thing, this label, that signifies where we will be going when we go up the stairs. We might call this semantic affordance. Other people call it linguistic affordance. But it's an abstracted, symbolic version of how we perceive and comprehend physical structure. J Gibson, in fact, talks about how, all of his work was really based on, like, the really core functions of perception. But he talked about how, like, something like a mailbox affords mailing a letter. But that's depending on all these cultural constructs. We see a mailbox, and it's not just an object that we can put a thing in. We think of it as, oh, that's a mailbox, because it's got all these signifiers that we have learned as being connected to this huge social construct that makes it mailbox, right? So there's signification going on, but there's also affordance. I'll just come right out and say, one of the reasons I'm harping on this is because Donald Norman was the one who mainly taught us all about affordances, but he comes from a different intellectual tradition, and so to him, he wants to say signifiers and affordances are different. I just think it's important to remember that it's all affordance, because it all comes back to the body. So I'll just put that out there. All right. Affordance is at the root of how we use language, as well as the simulated physicality of the stuff we put into interfaces, okay? The stairs intrinsically contain all the information your body needs to know about what they're going to do to my body. But look at this button, okay? So when people started making things with levers and buttons and things that were complex machinery or complex systems where the thing I'm doing is actually disconnected from the effect it's having in the world, this becomes a linguistic thing. The button, the affordance of the button, the physical information affordance of the button is I can push the button, and I've learned that when I was a little kid, pushing buttons, right? Little kids can't help but push buttons. So you push buttons and you know, oh, that's a button. It looks like a button. I think it's going to act like a button. Squish, squish, squish. What the button does has to be learned, or it has to be told to you. So this is something that we took and we ended up using in interfaces, right? This is why we have visual metaphors and graphical user interfaces. It's because it's borrowing from the affordances that we learned here in order to try to teach us, at least to give us some kind of scent for what it's going to do in this simulacrum within a screen. So when Microsoft updated Windows and added the Start button years ago, they were basically adding an invariant structure to the operating system so that users would know that no matter what, they could always start a new action from here. And like lots of other software, they use this simulated button, this little drop shadow. The button is not physical information. It's cross-dressed semantic information. It's semantic information that's simulating physical information, right? In other kinds of interfaces, and especially on the web with hypertext, a lot of times that button thing, that physical information kind of goes away. And we're just supposed to understand semantically that based on the context of a menu or a link or something, that, oh, this is a thing that I can touch and it's going to take me somewhere. And that's the other thing that hyperlinks added was now it's not just a button I push that makes a thing happen. It's a button I push that makes me happen to go somewhere else, right? And this is why we need information architecture, or at least that's why it got started. So this is really what's at the heart of this whole skeuomorphic flat thing. It's not really about aesthetics, even though lots of people talk about flat design as an aesthetic, it's Swiss or whatever. Yeah, maybe, but this is really the issue that people are trying to figure out, is this weird relationship between simulated physical and semantic information. So in iOS, with each successive rollout, they're like, maybe we should add buttons back in, right? Because people just can't tell. Is that just a word? What's that going to do? So you have to add some stuff back in to make it feel like a thing. All right. So here are some examples of where things perform both semantically and ecologically in confusing ways. In this email application, logically speaking, the red X's are all very different, but physically they're barely different at all, and they require a lot of thought to disambiguate their semantic meaning. When I used to use this at a prior job I had, and I was in a hurry, I would reach for the closest red X to do whatever I'm trying to do, and I would half the time hit the wrong one. So I would delete somebody's invitation, thinking I had declined it, right? And they're like, hey, are you going to come to the meeting? No, I declined the meeting. No, you didn't decline it. So I would get into that a lot. So I had to keep stopping myself, no, just don't think about which red X you're going to hit, which is kind of the counter to the whole point of having an interface like this. This was where my wife was trying to unsubscribe from Fab, and this was the interface where, you click unsubscribe, it takes you to this, and this big red button, we've learned, and the affordance of this in other environments is, this is to keep going. This is yes, I'm going to buy it. Yes, I want to leave, or whatever. This actually resubscribes you. So she did it 3 times over the course of a week before she finally realized, holy crap, look what they're doing. So this is basically an anti-pattern. Anti-patterns are things that screw around with our sense of affordance. All right, digital information. This is a little quicker. So the examples that we looked at weren't just any kind of semantic information. They were semantic information driven by digital technology. And digital technology relies on digital information. Digital information is how the black boxes talk to the other black boxes. It's ones and zeros. It's the lifeblood of information technology, but it doesn't have really much to do with us. When Claude Shannon founded the whole field of information theory, he basically said, the only way this is going to work well is if we strip all the human meaning out of it. Literally, that's what he said. So what that means is we've got all these gadgets that do amazing things and networks that do amazing things, but we have to do a lot of work to translate between this sort of alien semantics that black boxes use with each other to the way humans actually understand the world. This isn't stuff that we see directly very much. It's stuff that we see the effects of, and sometimes even just the cultural effects of digital thinking. So we see machines around us trying to get us to perceive what they are saying or what they want to hear from us. We see them murmuring to each other in these weird, noisy, machine-only semantics that we do not comprehend, either physically or semantically. The gas pump here has to have a sticker added to it that explains what interdata means, right? So some attendant had to kind of do the work that the engineer should have done. I temporarily changed my Twitter profile to have these coordinates. I don't have anything against these coordinates, but I just think it's a great example to say, I don't know where that is. That has no meaning to me. This is on a Cartesian grid that I have not memorized what these coordinates mean, right? So this is really leaning more toward the digital information space. This is how I need a machine to translate this for me. Physically, I'm standing here right now because you're picking up on information in the environment of my body here, talking to you and rambling on. And semantically, I could tell you I live in Philadelphia, and those of you who have seen a map or something or know of Philadelphia, or maybe you live there too, but I'm just saying a word, and you're taking that to mean a place that you know something about. You've got some history about it, whatever. And then there's digital. So I just think it's a good example of kind of that crosses all three. The Delta app has information that I, as a human, can read, but it gives priority to the machines that I encounter in the workflow of the airport. That's not a bad thing. It's just a design decision that had to be made. What's the priority of what is going to be talking to what? I doubt that anybody sort of brought an explicit model to figure this out. It's just a kind of a point-by-point thing. What I'm saying is this is pointing toward principles that we might be able to develop around how to make decisions like this. At this point in the service design conversation, this kind of a conversation is more important. Whereas if I go back one step, that QR code goes away, and it's really all about me. Avocado is a lovely app. I travel a lot. My wife and I use it as a way to have a shared place that's persistent. It's an invariant place that exists through our little phones and stuff. Basically, it's an app for couples. And so digital information is great in the way that it makes us able to do things like this. Like it has nice touches that actually kind of key into kind of an embodied experience. Like you can send a hug by just holding it to your chest, which is cute, right? You could hold it to your thigh or something else, but it feels a little bit like I'm cheating if I do that. So I always feel like guilty if I don't just hold it to my chest. Another nice touch is that you actually share the same password in the Avocado place. So they really thought a lot about how they can make this, the physicality of this, right, the rules behind the way the space works, feel like we're sharing a space together. But there are some broken invariants in a lot of these things, too. In fact, that's more the case than not. One reason Avocado can be so good at what it does is because it's just two people. As soon as you expand that to more people in different layers of access or permissions, it gets really crazy and really hard to do. Google Plus went overboard trying to give contextual clarity to people because their previous products had gotten them in a lot of trouble. But even here, on Google Plus on my phone, if I'm reading my family circle and I post a new message, it goes into the family circle. Just like if I'm talking to you right now and you say something back, you're assuming it's going to stay in this room, right? That's just something that we, in an embodied way, assume. But on the, on the desktop it works that way. On the mobile, it doesn't. So if I'm used to that and I try to do this, I'm going to end up saying things that I only want my family to hear that everybody's going to hear or see. So I have to do like 6 different interactions in order to change to get back to just the circle I want to post in, even though that's the one I was reading. This is the latest iteration of Facebook's meandering, strange, epic journey into mobile design, and which is getting better. But here, like, what is this? What does this mean, right? So one of the issues here is ontology, the meaning of things. What is the nature of a thing? Have we decided what it is? Like, I've worked with clients who are like, we want our customers to make lists. Okay, let's decide what we mean by list. And people are like, just start sketching lists, but no, those tend to fail because you have to think about what does a list mean to the user and what is it that they're going to be doing and what are the stages of making a list. And this is not that different in some ways because you've got a news feed, but you've got a news feed inside a news feed. And if I do most recent, how is that not news? Like, isn't news by definition what's recent? And what is all friends? Am I not getting all friends when I read my news or whatever? Like, this is information architecture 101 that they're getting completely wrong. I still don't really understand what any of this means. That's one of the reasons I just stay away from Facebook. I'm scared of it. Have been for years. Lowe's launched a thing a while back called My Lowe's, and as part of that, they said, get this My Lowe's card, right? And the problem is there's already a Lowe's card that's a consumer credit card. So you had things where people were in a checkout going, where the checkout person's saying, do you have your Lowe's card? Yeah, I'm paying with it. Right? No, you're my Lowe's card. Your Lowe's card? No, you're my. Who's on first? Second's on first. And when it works well, this kind of stuff is great, right? So this is just a very mundane example of going into Wegmans, an amazing grocery store chain that everybody should experience at some point. And I'm just in there, and I'm like, where is the damn peanut butter? And sure enough, I can pull up my phone and it knows what store I'm in, and I put in peanut butter and it tells me the aisle to go to. But to do this well takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work of taking language and making it coherent infrastructure, right? It means lots of boring stuff like metadata and all that. So ontology, I think, is something that we need to be thinking more about because we can't really have a good taxonomy or anything else without it. We have to understand what the thing is in order to know what it is in all these different contexts. Because language, as I said, is infrastructure, right? We're using labels, connections, and rules to create places, to create environments, and to thread them into the world around us in ways that we are not used to and that we've never really done before. So last slide, we're just going to go over a few things that feel to me like just sort of best practice-y type things that I've learned from all this. There's a lot more, but we'll talk about a few. One is, what are the invariants for perception and action? What grounds the experience that you're creating? What are the important things, the cornerstones, right, that people, without having to think too hard about it, people don't want to have to understand your business rules. They just don't. They just want to move forward and get stuff done. And remember that they're perceiving not by standing still and reading and understanding some kind of mental model. They don't want to take, that's too much work. People act in order to perceive. So they're just going to start poking stuff, throwing words into search fields. I mean, how many people have heard people complain, like, our users are only just using one word to search. They're not formulating good searches. I'm like, That's like the ground complaining because I'm just walking. I'm not like, being really careful about it and planning how I'm going to walk. No, don't expect people to do that. Back when all these systems we were making were really specialized and novel and new, maybe that was okay because people could expect to have to be trained and take a long time to learn stuff. Now we're surrounded by so much of this crap, you can't expect people to learn any of it. They just want to use it. How is it structurally nested in relation to a perceiver, right? Is it resilient for different perspectives and different contexts? If you try to make somebody understand your whole structure or to understand your hierarchy, that's too much work, right? I was just talking to somebody the other day who said that unlike the Lowe's thing and some other examples we were talking about like Starbucks, that one program that, I can't remember what retailer this was, but that it didn't matter if you used your consumer credit card or your key fob or whatever, or your phone number. It was all put together so that it would catch your behavior, your natural behaviors in whichever way that you were going to interact and have that service conversation. Is it clear what a place is and what is an object? Now this sounds, again, a little philosophical, but if you really look at stuff and go, is this perceived as a place or just a thing? That's a really interesting question. In not only in interfaces, but in all kinds of other semantic systems and complex systems that we try to design and put in front of people and make people use. And how are semantic and physical information working together or not? Are they helping each other? Are they getting in the way of one another? And that's also related to how are the rules behind the environment clearly expressed in its information? Stairs, the rules behind how stairs work, very clear, right? The rules behind how that button works, if I'm in a car and it says start engine, that's pretty clear. But man, we encounter all kinds of things where it's just not clear at all. And we expect people to have to learn more and more complex stuff that's hidden from them and does not have intrinsic information about how it works. So we need to fix that. Anyway, we have a long way to go to build these heuristics and these frameworks and these principles, but hopefully this is something of a start, and I'd love to talk to you about it at some point more. I have reached my time, so grab me afterwards. Thank you. I mean, this is a break at this point. I don't know if it's legit for me to take questions like this for a minute while other people file out, or if nobody's saying, okay, anybody have a question while I'm up here? No. It is the end of the day, and everybody's tired. So just grab me after. Okay, good. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.